Roll.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. I think we're just going to give it a couple of minutes to get folks, let a couple of more folks come on, and then we'll get started. Just to let folks know, this is being recorded. Thank you so much for your time on this lovely Sunday afternoon. I think we'll probably give it until around 12:05, and then we'll kick it off. Thank you all so much. All right, it's 12:03, so I think get started with sort of introducing the panel and our campaign. And as that happens, we'll let people trickle in kind of before we officially start the panel. My name is Caitlin Penner. I use she and they pronouns. I'm an urban planner living in New York City, and I'm also a member of the organizing committee for House the Future, which is DSA's campaign to create a social housing development authority. Now, what that essentially means is that we are trying to create a public authority that is capable of creating and acquiring, potentially rehabilitating, permanently affordable housing that is publicly owned, tenant-controlled, union-built, and sustainable. We define green social housing as being decommodified, meaning it's kind of independent from the pressures of financial markets that make housing costs rise or fall. It's democratically controlled, which means that the people who live in it have the power to make decisions about how their homes are managed and kind of kept up, and how upkeep is done. It's permanently affordable. It's built and operated with union labor, and it's built to high standards of environmental sustainability and resilience. In New York, we do have a really long history of social housing, unlike most of the rest of the United States, which still provides really crucial affordable homes to hundreds of thousands of households across the state. And we're going to talk about some of those homes today, specifically limited equity cooperatives. Limited equity cooperatives, for folks who don't know, are essentially a specific model of cooperative housing where people buy a share in a housing development corporation or some type of entity that gives them a stake in how those homes are managed, but the resale value of those shares are sharply limited, typically due to some sort of formula that restricts resale values. And this is in order to keep the co-op permanently affordable. We have some really, really great panelists here today who will be able to sort of help us talk through this really rich history of this form of housing here in New York. And I'm really excited to introduce them to you all. So our moderator today will be Nicholas Dagan-Bloom, who is the director of the Masters of Urban Planning program at CUNY Hunter College, of which I'm a proud alum. His research focuses on cities and their essential urban systems, including subsidized and public housing, and he is the author and co-editor of several books about New York City's housing landscape, including Public Housing That Worked, Public Housing Myths, and Affordable Housing in New York. We're also joined by Ben Holtzman, who is an assistant professor of history at Lehman College, who studies the intersection of political and social history in the United States, particularly as it applies to cities. His first book, The Long Crisis, New York City and the Path to Neoliberalism, describes how New York City transformed from a city with a robust social welfare system to a neoliberal city in the late 20th century. Anne Marie San Martino is a history at Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, and her research focuses on modern European history, urban history, and the history of migration. She is the author of Freedomland, Co-op City and the Story of New York, which explores the history of New York City through the lens of its largest limited equity cooperative. Jonathan Tarleton is an urban planner and writer who works on issues related to housing, social infrastructure, and economic development. His first full-length book, Homes for Living, The Fight for Social Housing in the New American Commons, details the challenges two social housing co-ops faced as they decided whether to privatize or remain limited equity. And last but certainly not least, Jennifer Baum is a filmmaker and writer who teaches composition at Montclair State University. Her memoir, Just City, explores the landscape of New York City's subsidized housing programs, especially the Mitchell-Lama program, which built tens of thousands of limited equity co-ops in her Upper West Side neighborhood over the course of 80 years. So I'm going to pass it off to Nick Bloom, who is our moderator for today. And thank you all once again so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the invite to you and to Bobby as well for the invite. I'm very happy to be here. I'm proud of all your progress in the world of housing. So you asked me, Caitlin, to sort of start out with a definition of Mitchell-Lama because it's kind of thrown around a lot. And it has a specific nature from 1955. It was a state-funded program to drive really the growth of middle-income housing. That's its initial creation, really, was to create middle-income housing, primarily in New York City, with strong support from emerging mayoral leadership in the city, also Robert Moses, a number of kind of the power players of the 1950s who were worried about the future of New York as a city of either the very rich or the very poor. I mean, you know, maybe it didn't have the impact they thought, but in any case, over time, there were a number of amendments to it, but fundamentally what it provided was forms of subsidy through inexpensive money, site assistance, and so forth, to a variety of different sponsors of housing, both private sector and ultimately nonprofit, and also the largest, which was the United Housing Foundation, a labor-driven organization, a consortium of labor unions. And they were able to take advantage of very attractive financing tools, land opportunities, and so forth to build really a remarkable system of housing, which is reflected today in we'll hear about from our various guests, but enormous complexes like Rochdale Village or Co-op City, which have no equal in the United States in terms of large-scale labor developed cooperative housing on a limited, as Caitlin was mentioning, a limited equity model. So I think one of the best ways to kind of get into this topic, though, is to have our different participants talk about what role Mitchell-Lama played, like this actual state level government program, because that, Caitlin, you're talking about a social housing authority, right? That's a state program. We don't think about the state enough, right, as this kind of sponsor, but maybe each of you could talk a little bit about what role the state played in this Mitchell-Lama program played in generating the communities to begin with. So maybe we'll start with Anne Marie, and then we'll go to Jennifer, Jonathan, and Ben can talk about.
First of all, for inviting me to be on the panel, Caitlin and Bobby, and thank you for the very warm introduction. It's really nice to be joining you. I will apologize in advance just before I start for any audio issues. I'm in a sort of strange apartment. Thank you. Great to hear, but that may not continue to be the case. I'm in a sort of strange apartment I'm in Berlin right now, and the sound carries in some weird ways. So you may hear children and you may hear a lot of things, but apologies in advance. In any event, Co-op City is the largest development that was built with Mitchell-Lama funding, and really the last large development that was built with Mitchell-Lama housing. It is indeed a United Housing Foundation development, also their largest and final development. I mean, to put it bluntly, Co-op City would not exist were it not for Mitchell-Lama funding. It was able to, although they do go up slightly, it's still well below market rates. They are also able to, there's a tax abatement and sort of, that enables the construction of Co-op City. I mean, basically everything that goes into it allows it to exist. And the similar to what Professor Bloom was saying, the power players that created Mitchell-Lama were also very much the power players behind Co-op City, even in other forms, sort of, in a sense, greasing the bureaucratic wheels that allow it to be constructed. At the same time, so Co-op City in some ways can be a great success of Mitchell-Lama. At the same time, one thing that Mitchell-Lama was essentially funding, for the most part, at the outset of a construction. It's sort of construction subsidies. And Co-op City, in some ways, is also a cautionary tale about Mitchell-Lama, because over the 60s and the 70s, as construction costs rise, there isn't the flexibility within the Mitchell-Lama structure itself, aside from increasing some of the tax abatements in order to continue to keep costs as low as they initially were promised to cooperators. So part of this is a story about what Mitchell-Lama can do, but it's also, if we were to try and, thinking towards the future, thinking of, how's the future, kind of what we might want to learn from Mitchell-Lama in terms of sort of more successful modern application.
Yeah, program design being a big element. Right. Jonathan, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much for having me, Caitlin and Bobby, and the rest of the Housing the Future team. And it's such a joy to be here with all the panelists as well, all of whom I've drawn from your work for many years, and so this is a lot of fun. I mean, I think to piggyback on something Anne Marie was just touching on is when Mitchell-Lama was initially conceived, I think it was really thought of as a kind of set it and forget it kind of thing. It's like we can make this initial investment in this housing, which was really seen as a counterweight to white flight and suburbanization. It was like, how do we keep the middle class in the city? We can entice them with these new, very high quality, affordable ways to own a home in New York City. and then we don't have to do any more investing. It'll just take care of itself. And you know, Co-op City is a great example of that was absolutely not the case, and it's not the case with really any of these co-ops. And it should be said, Mitchell-Lama had both rental and co-op sides, though we'll talk more about co-op here today. And I think that's, you know, that's something to note, that throughout time, both the changing nature of New York City, when these developments were built, you know, they were extremely high quality. People really, you know, it was a no-brainer to go live in a Mitchell-Lama development. The idea of even privatization wasn't really all that salient. It's like, oh yeah, sure, the value could rise, but you know, this is such a good deal. Why would we ever do that? The real estate environment of New York was entirely different. Um, and that changes over time. Many of these buildings are now over 50 years old. They have major maintenance needs that comes with any building getting older. And so the state and the city continue to play a really important role with regard to providing cheap financing to take care of major building needs, to do that sort of maintenance that is required of anything. And so I think the idea that, you know, the set it and forget it model, it was always not going to work, but we know that you know, it requires ongoing support from city and state moving forward. So I'll stop there. But
Jennifer, that's great. Jennifer, do you want to pick up the thread there?
Sure. Yeah, again, thank you for including me in this discussion and to meet all of you in person. So the Upper West Side, where I grew up and where I wrote about, really benefited enormously from Mitchell-Lama housing. The whole nature of that neighborhood would not have retained the kind of diversity that you see today if it had not been for Mitchell-Lama housing. Because, you know, we all know what the Upper West Side has become today. It's really a place that you have to move into. You have to be really wealthy. And it's you know, the Upper West Side, the West Side Urban Renewal Area Plan, which redeveloped this stretch of land from 87th Street to 97th Street between Amsterdam and Columbus, was predominantly made up of Mitchell-Lama housing as well as NYCHA housing. And so it, you know, thanks to Mitchell-Lama, the Upper West Side is actually a place that you can still consider a thriving, diverse neighborhood. And, you know, it's interesting because I think that Mitchell-Lamas on the Upper West Side did not have the same kind of financial problems as Mitchell-Lamas that were built in less affluent areas. I know that the building I grew up in, which is still public, though there's constantly a fight to privatize it, has like pretty much been able to maintain, you know, the building. What's gotten in the way are people who want to privatize it, who are refusing to accept low-cost mortgages that the city is offering. So the whole idea that Mitchell-Lama was made and then, you know, left to its own devices, I think worked and failed based on the neighborhoods where they were built. So I would say the ones on the Upper West Side seem to be thriving, except for this barrier to people who want to privatize it.
Interesting. I mean, I think overall there's a wider thrive. I mean, it depends what success, how you define success, but I mean, I see a broader success more on other cooperatives too. But it's interesting to hear about the Upper West Side. Ben, do you want to sort of draw out maybe some of the larger, you know, sort of the role of Mitchell-Lama in creating, you know, this kind of milieu, perhaps?
Well, actually, I was going to go in a different direction.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, which was, I mean, I was just thinking of, since I could maybe speak a little bit more about HDFCs, just to have
Sure.
that sort of get them in here, unless we're going to kind of have another.
Yeah, go for it. And can you define it also? While
Yeah, so HDFCs are housing development fund corporations, but in essence are designated low-income housing cooperatives in the city. There is about 1,200 providing about 25,000 units of housing, roughly 100,000 people, which is either large or small, depending on your perspective. But they come out of a very different history than Mitchell-Lama, which is principally the history and the crisis of building abandonment in the late 1960s and 70s in New York. And we can talk about all the reasons why that was happening, all the sort of longstanding disinvestment in low income areas of color in particular, and the crisis of, and the inability of, and continued inability of, but certainly at the time, the inability of the private market to adequately provide housing for people who are of low incomes, right? People who are poor, right? And various kinds of low income. So in essence, if we, not to go on too long about the history, but I do think the history is important here for understanding this kind of housing, which is that they were, so most of the HDFCs that exist in the city today, or many of them, were formed in the 1980s out of this longer standing crisis of affordability, especially after the city became the owner of a lot of these buildings. Once landlords walked away from them for not paying taxes and really wanting to kind of extract all the resources that they could out of these buildings, and then kind of have the city essentially take them over. It's the scale of the landlord abandonment is really something that's difficult to conceptualize given what New York real estate has been like for several decades. But nevertheless, it was something that happened not terribly long ago on a fairly wide scale. And so it took the heroic efforts of people who were living in at least some of these buildings that were abandoned to really steer them towards recovery, and over the 1980s, advocating to the city and working with the city ultimately in the Koch administration to set up a pathway to form them into low-income cooperatives. And so, so again, like rather than being kind of middle-income housing, we're talking about what has at least historically principally been low-income housing, although again, it gets, as time goes on, that gets fishier, and we can talk about that. Predominantly, again, at least initially, people of color, although always racially mixed, but disproportionately Black and Puerto Rican folks. And in terms of the role of the state, though, I think the biggest way that that has remained true, to go back to your original question, these cooperatives do receive tax abatements. There's more to say about all of this, of course, but and of course the state also, I think, providing funding to some major organizations and nonprofits that provide sort of guidance and support to HDFCs is also a really critical role, rather than
the cooperator training kind of things.
Exactly right. So I'm thinking of groups like Urban, UHAB, and kind of similar kinds of groups that work with these organizations or these cooperatives to try to provide trainings and guidance and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Super. So, I mean, what's interesting about New York's, I think we've already gotten there a little bit, is that you have such a wide range of income and ethnic groups, right, living in cooperative housing in New York. And maybe it would be good for the other panelists also to talk a little bit about the changes. Like initially, well, it was designed as middle income, primarily white housing, right, in the 50s and into this little bit of the 60s. But how have these communities changed over time? I think Ben was getting into that a little bit, but maybe Jennifer, you want to start and talk about demographic change, both from an income and ethnicity point of view in these communities.
What's interesting that you say that they were built initially to keep white people in, and that is true, but when you think about the history of RNA House, which is the building I grew up in, RNA House was sponsored by a civic organization called Riverside Neighborhood Assembly, which was made up of lots of different civic groups in the neighborhood on the west side, and they deliberately sought out an integrated demographic to live in the building. The building was initially designed just for teachers, and when they weren't able to attract enough teachers, they opened it up. But there were tables outside of the construction site on 96th Street in Spanish and in English, bilingual flyers advertising the co-ops. What they were afraid of was that the co-ops that the co-ops on the Upper West Side, and specifically RNA House, would be primarily Jewish, because Jews had historically been involved in the creation of co-ops, and Jews understood what they were, whereas newcomers who, Puerto Ricans specifically, or Black people in the neighborhood, had no idea. They were they wanted to stay. They'd rather stay in what they knew, even if it was undesirable, than move into something that seemed completely unknown. So there was like real outreach to people living in the neighborhood to move in, and it worked. And so it was diverse from the beginning. It was integrated from the beginning.
That's terrific. And what year was RNA House?
19, it opened in 1967.
67. So it's a little bit right in the sort of in that ferment of the 1960s, a little bit versus the mid 50s, kind of when this program sort of began.
Right. Well, the West Side urban renewal area kind of came after. It was a sort of, it was able to look back and have some perspective of what had happened in the 50s, so it could sort of do things differently in the 60s.
Absolutely. Anne-Marie, do you want to comment on this at all?
Very briefly, okay. Well, it's over 15,000 apartments. It's the largest before. It's very large, and it was viewed from the beginning in terms of in relation to problems of the city, something that as a solution in particular, as a solution to white flight from the city, which also, so Co-op City is initially 64, it gets its approvals in 65, and first residents move in 68, and then construction concludes in 72. So a similar time frame as what Jennifer was just talking about, but in a very different context. We're talking about the Northeast Bronx, right? And it was conceived of by the city, sees this as a solution to white flight. This is why it's getting this attention, and also as a way to provide good housing for people who for the sort of middle class that are otherwise potentially falling through the cracks by the mid 60s. The United Housing Foundation, they see this as an alternative to tenements housing, to sort of low, poor housing for what they were doing on the low. They initiated on the Lower East Side, whatever. Okay. In the being built, the United Housing Foundation is run by essentially white labor-oriented Jews. Initially enter into United Housing Foundation developments. The city by 1967 becomes concerned. I'm going to make this very, very brief, but within a year or two, the city starts becoming concerned that rather than being a solution to white flight, actually Co-op City is a cause of it, because what it's doing is attracting white Jews essentially from the West Bronx, from the neighborhoods around the concourse, to the East Bronx. And for where they've left will become poorer, will become more, will become, destabilize those neighborhoods. All of their developments from the very beginning they do not officially, they're not like restricted covenants or anything like that. Anyone can move in, but of course, because the people at the center of the movement, the people that know the most, this repeats something Jennifer was saying to some extent, they're white Jews. So it's like involved with the labor movement. So it's their people it's like a lot of people who know each other. So the city in 67 and 68 forces them to advertise in the Black and Hispanic press. And also just the mere size of Co-op City means that they sort of run out of the people that are friends of someone, word of mouth. And so over the time that Co-op City is people are putting in applications, et cetera, the development becomes less white and less Jewish. When Co-op City opens, its demographics in terms of race roughly reflect the demographics of New York City as a whole. More Jewish, the balance of white, Black, and Hispanic, pretty similar to the city as a whole, albeit more, what?
We're losing you. You're kind of breaking up here and there, Anne-Marie, just so you know.
It'd be a problem. I'm trying my best. But
we're following you.
Okay. I'll do my best here. So, and maybe I'll stay a little closer to the computer. But so more Black. It is now a majority Black. When it initially opened, it was but they didn't have around 3/4 white. It is now well over 50% Black, a large percentage of Hispanic residents. I forget the exact numbers, but it has shifted quite a bit. The biggest change happening really in the decade of the 1980s and 90s. And Co-op City in terms of class has remained remarkably stable. It class in the 60s, if you look at income census, like income numbers, it was middle class in like 1970, and it's kind of middle class today. And so what you've sort of watched and what is, I wouldn't say unique, but particular about Co-op City and really reflects Mitchell-Lama as a whole in terms of the development, the structure of the program, is that you've seen racial transition without really class transition. So
a great point. It's a very interesting point. It has that kind of stability, like as the city's overall demographics have changed, right? Yet they have remained as these kind of middle class communities. Jonathan, do you want to comment on that? And we'll go to Ben.
Yeah. I mean, something that's coming to mind, especially as Jennifer's talking about the history of RNA House and Amory Co-op City, I think it bears noting that not all of these developments were constructed with a strong ethic necessarily from the standpoint of the developer. So the two co-ops I really focus on in my book, Southbridge Towers, which is no longer a Mitchell-Lama, but is in Lower Manhattan, and St. James Towers, which is in Clinton Hill, in Brooklyn. Both of these were developed by Tishman Speyer. No slouch in big real estate, right? So these were not developed by a UHF or a civic group. These were big developers who were drawn to the program because they were great deals. It was a great deal for a developer. It was de-risked. There was so much city or state money in it. There was money to be made, even if it was quote unquote limited profit for them. There was so little risk. So I think
and Jonathan, can I just mention, so we didn't talk about this much, but there were, to sweeten the pot in the late 50s and early 60s, basically there were these kind of exit ramps for cooperatives and for owners, right, to allow them to go private. So I just want
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up, Nick, as well, because I think one really important aspect of the history of the Mitchell-Lama program is the introduction of this idea of privatization, which happens in the late 50s. But really, that was there to incentivize more rental construction. So that was, and you can see why that makes sense from an incentive standpoint. In a cooperative development, the developer builds the building and then it sells it off entirely to the residents. The developer no longer has a stake. In a rental, they might hold on to that building for, say, in 15, 20 years until that privatization becomes possible, where they could raise rents to a market rate. So the privatization is actually there to say, sweeten the pot, as you're saying, for rental developers. It doesn't actually incentivize more co-op development. I think that was actually kind of a legislative mistake in many respects. But one thing I'm glad we're talking about, race as it relates to these buildings. St. James in Brooklyn is a predominantly Black cooperative. It really reflected the neighborhood, despite the fact that it was built as part of the Pratt Institute urban renewal area as a way to insulate the Pratt Institute from the surrounding neighborhood. So it was never really, that was not the intention, but it's a wonderful community. Southbridge really also reflects the surrounding neighborhoods. It ended up with a lot, predominantly white cooperative with a lot of folks moving in from the Lower East Side. When we look till now, Southbridge went through, a decade-long privatization fight, which it ultimately did privatize. Race became a really important factor there, in part because one of the narratives that went into privatization was a fear of tipping towards the projects. So if you think about Lower Manhattan, you have Southbridge Towers. The neighborhood has changed dramatically post 9/11. It has, gone from a really commercial district into having a real luxury turn. And Southbridge residents see that. They feel somewhat out of place, and there is also a lot of class anxiety and a sense that as the development becomes more racially diverse, they are getting closer and closer to being a NYCHA development. And so and I should say, this is of course not a widely held belief across the entire cooperator body, but among folks who are very, very strong proponents of privatization, this is something that they're arguing for. They're saying we do not want to become NYCHA. And that's why, you know, we can't have a conversation about housing or affordability in New York or US as a whole without talking about those, you know, those narratives around race and value and, you know, what the neighborhood will become. So.
And do you want to jump in on this one with some?
Well, yeah, maybe I'll just say, because I think it does speak to, you know, we initially were talking a bit about kind of the affordability and compositional changes. I mean, the principal way, so for HDFC is again, these kind of low income or by definition, supposed to be low income cooperatives that I'm principally talking about. The primary way in which they have, by the way in which that's enforced is through income restrictions around purchasers, right? So that then gets into things like area median income, so which is for even these designated low income cooperatives is upwards of 165%, which by definition is of course much higher than the typical income of the community or the general area that in which the cooperative, this low income cooperative is located. So by and large, HDFCs, you know, in many respects have remained a, you know, pretty extraordinary beacon of low-income housing in the city. But because there's not the same, because of that principal way in which that affordability is enforced being through income of purchasers, right? That opens up a lot of opportunities in various ways for people who, you know, I think by just about any definition wouldn't be considered low income to be able to come into those buildings or purchase into those buildings. Now, and again, and what you feel about that, I think, you know, there's a lot of arguments, right? I mean, on the one hand, certainly by and large, those people, that means that those cooperatives are still providing housing for what are generally moderate or maybe middle income people. But is the HDFC then kind of going outside of its core mission of providing low income housing, right? And this is also kind of another thing to consider here is, right, that those new purchasers bring in capital to what are longstandingly low, you know, economically kind of precarious buildings, right? So these are all kinds of issues that remain critical when we're thinking about how do we not just create, whether it's lower income or median income housing, but how do we preserve it as being affordable over the long term? And, you know, who's setting the definitions of affordable, all those kinds of things, right? That I'm sure that for all those of us who think about these things, we know our issues, but I'll just kind of flag that for now. Also, because I didn't say it at the beginning, I do just want to really quickly say thank you to everybody who put a lot of labor into organizing this panel. I really, really am grateful. And especially the people here the organizers and the people behind who are attending, who are really working on these issues in communities and across the city and state or in your own communities. I'm really, really grateful to the organizing efforts that you're doing. So thank you. And thank you to my fellow panelists who are all brilliant. Thanks.
So Ben, well, let's pick up on that. I mean, I think since we really are, this is a DSA event, right? Like we should maybe, since we have you all here, and I think Ben, you were kind of going towards this, like that income question, right? How do you maintain the kind of equity proposition of a cooperative, which is part of a larger city, right? And income levels. But maybe we could go around the group and sort of talk about what do you think, like if you were to talk to somebody who, you know, with this like social housing authority, like you've studied these communities, like what should we learn from them to make a usable, like how is this a usable past, right? In terms of what matters for creating new cooperatives, let's say, for the future. Maybe we'll start with Jonathan this time, and then we'll cycle back around.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, you know, one thing that is it's kind of an obvious point is that these off ramps of privatization are they're a tremendous trap, I think. So something that occurs in a lot of these co-ops that, you know, I should say that for a co-op to quote unquote privatize, which we should
Yeah.
interrogate that
Lay it out
language a
there,
little bit,
Jonathan.
in part because these co-ops are already private. They're entirely private entities. They get, of course, subsidy, just like every other form of housing, many forms of housing in the US do, including single family homes. But they are private entities. And to privatize essentially means to remove the limited equity provisions on their shares, meaning that instead of someone, in the 1970s, someone could buy into one of these Mitchell-Lamas for $3,000. Today, if they were to quote unquote privatize the co-op, some of these some of these units could, or shares could go for, a million, easy. So to privatize means to remove essentially the public purpose of providing this kind of permanently affordable housing. And that possibility of privatization is really only available to very high performing co-ops. In order to do that, you have to pay down your city or state mortgage, which is onerous, which is difficult. But these are arguably the co-ops we also most want to keep in the program. We want to ensure that this very well managed, very well maintained housing remains permanently affordable to the folks on the wait list who are waiting for these units, for the folks in the future. Another aspect of privatization is that it consumes the entire life of these places.
Yeah.
Everything starts to be rooted through the lens of privatization. And there are literally, you can think of a co-op, they're supposed to be very democratic enterprises. They have boards, there are elections for these boards. In the co-ops that I am most familiar with, you end up having little political parties. You literally have parties running slates of candidates strictly on the basis of privatization, which means that everything else, a lot of other things fall by the wayside. Jennifer mentioned it earlier, where folks will forego taking very low interest debt or financing from the city or state in order to maintain the possibility of privatizing, because that debt comes with the hook. It says, okay, if you take this debt, you have to stay in the program for another 15 years. So they'll forego maintenance, or they will pay much higher interest rates, which actually increases affordability challenges in the building in order to maintain the possibility of privatization. So that issue in itself, if we were to build, this social housing development authority today, I expect that wouldn't even be on the table. But we do have to remember the history of Mitchell-Lama is that this was not on the table to begin with. This wasn't as a part of the original law. And so there's an aspect of what I like to think of as social maintenance of these programs, where we think about the physical maintenance of a building or the financial maintenance of these co-ops as being very important, but continuing to instill the purpose for what they were built, which is a public purpose, is also deeply important. We see this change over generations. Many of these places have 3 generations of cooperators living in them. And as time goes by, the whole idea of the co-op, what it is for, it sort of drains out of it a little bit. And that's not to be unexpected given the prevailing environment of New York City, which is real estate obsessed. Everybody, when they see the possibilities for what profit could bring from selling one of these shares on the open market, all of a sudden it's like dollar signs, goo goo eyes, like woo, 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 millions of dollars. And frankly, these folks have real material needs. There are people in these developments who are trying to figure out how to pay for elder care, who are trying to think about how to meet real financial needs in their lives. And they've been taught by a prevailing narrative that the way to build wealth or the way to pay for those necessary life needs is to instrumentalize your housing to do that. That is the American way. And this is an alternative model. And so there has to be this kind of continual pushback about this is both the purpose and this is what your benefits are. A lot of advocates of Mitchell-Lama, and I think this is a great phrase, is like, we get our benefits up front. We have low maintenance costs. We are able to save on a monthly basis. I know folks in these co-ops who have second homes now who have been able to send all of their kids to college because of their low housing costs. But they also don't have the option on the back end to, refinance their mortgage and take money out and, pay for a home health aid with that. So I think we have to grapple with that larger environment and the continual narrative need to say, this is what this is for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Jennifer, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I agree entirely that the idea that these Mitchell-Lamas could one day no longer be affordable has to like not be on the table at all in new Mitchell-Lama legislation. These homes should be built that are permanently affordable. Second thing I want to say is that when my family moved into RNA House in 1967, there was a real ethos about cooperative living. We called ourselves co-operators, and we did things like we formed committees to better the building. We had co-ops. There was a babysitting co-op, there was a food co-op. Mothers would go up to the Bronx, to Hunts Point, and get food and then resell it in the co-op, in the laundry room, to people in the building, as well as other people in neighboring Mitchell-Lamas, as well as other tenements and brownstones. The babysitting co-op was all done, through mutual benefit. Like, there was this real ethos of cooperative living. And there was also an ethos of supporting the local public school. So there was this like democratic ideal that was embedded in the conception of these co-ops, at least on the Upper West Side.
I think it was very broad, Jennifer. I mean,
Okay, well, that's what I can speak to, is the Upper West Side. It's great if it was broad. I mean, Jonathan mentioned that some developers, they were just in it for the money, and sure, like that, there's that aspect. But the ones that I know of on the Upper West Side which were sponsored by different civic organizations, as well as union-backed cooperative housing. I mean, like Penn South, for instance, is a great model. There was this idealism built into it. And, over the generations, and like what Jonathan said about the demographics and changing, and about how everyone is so real estate obsessed, and how this is our retirement fund, turn our homes into equity. We've got to really fight that and instill this idea of what these original buildings were built for, and how, you can create some kind of like real sort of politicization. I mean, my family, we were politicized by these group actions that we took together. We brought prices down when we all bought appliances together when we first, moved into the building. So I think that's like, fundamental to continuing to have thriving cooperative housing in this city. We need to instill the reason why they exist in the first place, the way they can benefit people, and continue to like politicize people in this manner.
Right. And I it's interesting, it's a little, maybe Anne Marie wants to comment on this, but the United Housing Foundation, for instance, did this cooperator training. I know, Ben, you can talk about the cooperator training, but I think Jonathan kind of laid out, like, legislatively, off-ramps are a bad idea, whatever, but then I think what you're getting to, Jennifer, maybe Anne Marie or Ben want to comment on this too, is that as part of preservation, we're always looking very much at the financial side of preservation, as opposed to the cultural kind of policy of preservation. And if you do one without the other, it's sort of like, well, it just becomes more tenuous, right? Back to the original ideas of these places. Anne Marie or Ben, do you want to comment on that at all?
By the way, the video in the hopes of conserving bandwidth. So I heard let's see how it goes. Okay, so listening to all three of you, I've been thinking of a few different things. One is that, Co-op City starts actually similarly with this cooperator training, as you were mentioning it. And with this ethos, I actually went to a cooperative nursery school, there was like cooperative, grocery store cooperative, optometrist, whatever. And the United Housing Foundation had in its own way this idea of creating a sort of cooperative economic sphere. And that Co-op City, because of its size, actually could be the nucleus of expanding that everywhere within the city and then even beyond that. However, those ideas, lovely as they are, and you know, fell flat in a way because they themselves could not control the rise of costs. That the state, essentially, Co-op City had massive cost overruns as it was built. There's a series of carrying charge, essentially, you know, increases, essentially maintenance cost increases that eventually trigger a rent strike. And so by the time, so I grew up in Co-op City, but I grew up after the rent strike, while there were still some of these legacies, like the cooperative grocery store, the cooperative nursery school, et cetera, it was a much more conflictual relationship there. I think that one of the things that's important is, like, you know, money really does kind of, it can do, not important, it very much is, but like, you also need the money side. With that in mind, one other point I wanted to make is that in some ways, Co-op City's history tells us that there can be issues both in a way when cooperative housing is too expensive and also in a way when it's too cheap. And by that, what I mean is that on the one hand, like, Jonathan did a very nice job laying out the sort of like siren song of privatization, which is hilarious in Co-op City's case because they have a huge mortgage they may never get out of. It just keeps going up because of all of these construction defects, all of these issues that just, I mean, you know, but yet at the same time, there was a period in which Co-op City politics was absolutely dominated by discussions of privatization. That has somewhat died down at this point. But it's still like this feeling that some people have that, like, you can't really realize a profit from it. You know, if you move, I mean, there's some, but nothing compared to what you can in other parts of New York, for sure. At the same time, buying into Co-op City was initially, so when it was originally, Co-op City was initially built, it was a $450 per room equity down payment. And that was prohibitively, while it was only quote unquote, a few $1,000s, that was, you know, really prohibitive for a lot of people who otherwise could afford the monthly carrying charge costs. And so when Co-op City faces in the 80s a vacancy crisis, the state allows them to make carrying charges, rather, the equity deposit financeable. And that opens up Co-op City to a wider range of people. And there's real debate about this, right? Because if you open it up to a wider range of people, will you have people moving in who actually can't afford the monthly charges? Will you wind up destabilizing the cooperative? The United Housing Foundation at the beginning thought that the equity charge was vital, this equity down payment essentially, because what it did was force people to have a kind of investment up front. Yet at the same time, I'm not sure you could, I think in some ways you could argue that making that charge financeable actually contributed to the longer term stability in the 90s and beyond. So I'm not saying, I don't really have like a great answer either way. I'm a historian, not a policy person, but I think it's worth thinking about different financing options and thinking really seriously about what those trade-offs might look like in different environments. You know, in the 1970s, you could see why the idea of realizing profits, or the 60s, you know, from housing in New York was like, okay, whatever, you know, you had a bigger problem with housing that entirely lost its value, as you know, Ben was talking about at the outset of our discussion. On the other hand, then by the 90s and certainly in the 21st century, the possibility of housing being a piggy bank, or, you know, your sort of retirement savings, is a much bigger, you know, both opportunity and threat, depending on where you're looking at it. So within a, you know, as long as we live under capitalism on some level, thinking through what these different options really mean and responding to those, I think, is just an important thing to bear in mind.
Ben, do you want to pick up from there, perhaps?
No, I think I would maybe just really quickly, when we're thinking about the creation and preservation of, you know, low-income housing, you know, to reemphasize the points that people have made about permanent affordability, about this notion of set it and forget it doesn't work. They require continued monetary and other kinds of support. And also the points people made about the kind of instilling the mission, right, and democratic participation within those units, but also the larger mission of why that housing was created and what the intent is. I think those are all just really important points to keep in mind for all of this.
So we have maybe time for one more question, and maybe it will focus in a little bit on this sort of governance question a little bit, because I think that actually is a big part of it. We're kind of circling kind of governance question, a lot of this. I think we've done a good job at talking about like exchange versus use value a little bit, right? And sort of things like that. But in what ways are the sort of the cooperative model in New York help or hinder, and the governance model that has been put in place, the kind of maintenance of cooperatives and also cooperative values? You can talk about your specific places you've looked at, and Ben can talk about HFTCs and so forth as well in that. If you want to, let's see, we'll start with, I guess, Jonathan. Go ahead. Governance.
Sure. Yeah, I love this question. I love talking about governance. I do think it is central. I mean, I think something to note is that the current, model, especially for Mitchell-Lama's, it does ask a lot of cooperators. It asks them to, despite their ability to bring in consultants, the need for professional, high quality property management of these places is really crucial. But at the end of the day, you have your board who is making pretty complex financial decisions about very large, as Emery is pointing out, very large places. I mean, Southbridge Towers, it has over 1,600 units. There are over 4,000 people living there. St. James Towers is smaller at over 300, but these are still places that require a lot from the people who live there. And I think there's actually an interesting point about scale here, which is that when you have a bigger co-op, you have a lot more people to draw on for that governance. And people get burned out. People don't want to stay on the board. It really helps if someone happens to have accounting expertise, someone happens to have legal expertise. That really actually makes a big difference in the life of and duration of the co-op.
Construction.
Yeah, construction.
Otherwise, you're
very
at mercy.
useful.
Yeah.
I also think there is, and I think this goes back to a question of, what would policies under a social housing development authority look like? Is, these are places that are wholly owned by the people who live there. And so there are really good arguments as to why, oh, I am a cooperator, or the decision of the cooperators should govern. That is a common argument for privatization. It's the decision of the co-op. It's a democratic process, but there's been such significant public investment into these entities for a very particular purpose that we have to rethink what it means to be democratic in this sense. There are wait lists of thousands of people who are potential future beneficiaries of this housing that get shredded if privatization occurs.
Right.
There are people in the neighborhood who, the fact that a Mitchell-Lama may exist there, or this affordable housing exists there, it has major effects for the neighborhood. So I think this actually goes not so much to the cooperators themselves, but to, we can talk about New York City Housing Preservation and Development, the state HCR, the regulatory agencies that and our elected officials, that they need to represent the public in this regard. They need to be vocal about privatization. In some cases they are, in some cases they're not. It really depends on the development, the neighborhood, the individuals involved. But to be democratic, to me, in this sense, is to not let the will of the cooperators, the official owners alone govern these places. And I think this gets into a question about what is the right balance between regulatory oversight and cooperator autonomy. That is a tricky one. There's no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, these are built for a public purpose, and we need to maintain that.
Yeah, in another world, there would be, for instance, public represent. It wouldn't just be at that moment where you're kind of like a legal agreement to extend, right, the affordability, that they would have a place at the table, right? That you could definitely see a public representation. That's such an interesting. I don't know, I thought about that. That's very interesting. Does anyone else have comments?
Well, just to piggyback.
Okay.
I just want to make one quick point, which is to say, I mean, it's an obvious one, right? But I mean, if the state was more invested, or if we put greater investment on the creation of new kinds of developments,
Mhm.
like those ones that had previously
Fair
existed,
point.
right? Like that. I mean, again, a kind of obvious point, but like, that would relieve some of the pressure on those wait lists, right? So, everything Jonathan said was brilliant. It's to say nothing to take away from the points that he was making, but it's just to sort of speak to what the great, tremendous need is for these kinds of developments, right? So if we were actually creating more of them and doing more to ensure their permanent affordability, not let units necessarily escape from the programs, right? That then it would kind of relieve some of those pressures that Jonathan was speaking to.
Great point. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean the larger context really does matter, where it's like this little shrinking pie, right? And it just becomes. I mean, I think all your books have this. Like it's like the free zone, the tension just gets out of control because you're like, this is just like a zero sum game. If we go, if you go private, that's it. There's like this neighborhood is like there's
Right.
this diversity. Right?
I just want to
Jennifer, go
add
ahead.
that the New York State Legislature recently passed legislation making it harder to privatize.
Yes.
So it's now 80% of cooperators have to vote in favor of privatization, and that's actually made a big difference. So there are ways to fight the privatization trend. And I also just want to say that I don't think that there has to be a conflict between regulatory commissions and cooperators. If you remove this idea that the building could become private, if you just take that away, if you take that out of the equation, then there's no reason why cooperators and regulatory organizations can't just work together to improve conditions in the buildings.
I mean, that is sort of the HFDC model, right? I mean, there is a cooperative, element between HPD and other agencies to help those cooperatives stabilize. But I do think that in many cases, by the way, Jennifer, great point too, because your book does a really good job showing the importance of that kind of slow roll towards privatization, right? That you can actually, whether you have somebody on the board or not, you can have a structure, right, that slows down this kind of race towards privatization. Anne-Marie, did you want to contribute anything on this?
Sure, just briefly. I think that, one thing, it's funny. So one thing I haven't talked about yet is the Co-op City rent strike in the mid-1970s, which is the largest rent strike in American history, and was done specifically because, in a sense, the role that the state and the United Housing Foundation had built and managed, tens of thousands of apartments before this, that by the mid-1970s, they're dealing with factors that go beyond governance in the sort of narrow sense. Costs are going up, and that they wanted to pass those on to cooperators. And there was this call for resident control, with this idea that residents would do a better job with this. The reality, though, was that the residents do get control in the mid-70s. And they also aren't really able to do it. And they believe that, they could call upon the expertise of the people living there, and retired engineer or accountants that were there that could all contribute their expertise. But it turns out, professional property management is really hard to do with volunteers, whatever their level of expertise, with limited time, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes, and Co-op City struggles with this really for decades, until they did finally bring in professional management, but that was only like 20 years ago. And even then, there's continued to be concerns with management. And I think that some of what we're dealing with, like in the best of cases, and in some ways, Jennifer's book tells us a little bit about what this looks like, where you can have people, different kinds of stakeholders working together to, for the good of the cooperative, and for the, on multiple levels, and for the good of the society around that cooperative. You can also have very dysfunctional situations, almost regardless of the governance model. And so I think, to some extent, trying to think of ways, like kind of a flexibility and a willingness to kind of, I don't know, in Co-op City's case, there's sort of on all sides this constant attempt to keep costs down, which always becomes a problem. It's like just redounds in the opposite way. And sort of, I think, fighting that generalized, kind of austerity mindset on the front end, I think, is part of a broader story of how to create stakeholders that can actually work. But even then, it's something that that changes over time in different circumstances, et cetera. So hopefully that was all hearable, and I'd
It
love to.
was. I think it
All
worked.
right, yay.
All right, so we did promise questions, and I do respect that. We've got a few questions up here. Maybe we'll start with a sort of straightforward one from Max Gordy here. Well, actually, no, we'll start with the first one that went up. Chris Johnson's question here. And maybe, Ben, you want to take a look at this one because it's a little detailed. But the question is like, I think it's something about like the success rate of HFTC. And by the way, I think, you know, the HFTC model is likely to become even more important. You know, if the real estate industry really abandons all this housing that they're threatening to do, right? I don't know about that, you know, but anyway, there could be an opportunity for many more, right, in REM property foreclosures and sort of taking over in a new blossoming, right, of small scale HFTCs. Do you want to comment at all, Ben? I mean, since you've really looked at this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Just, I don't know if the question is about HDFCs in general or about UHAB in particular. I mean, I'm sort of less able to speak to the kind of forensics of UHAB. I mean, I think that they do a really terrific job overall, but I'm sure that there are issues that come up. I mean, we also have to remember these are, you know, UHAB is comprised of human beings, and these these cooperatives themselves are typically really struggling. I mean, these are low income housing that are facing a lot of problems, and so ensuring success in every case, right, is takes enormous amounts of work on behalf of the people who live there and the people who are trying to support them. That's to say, not to take away from any of the criticisms that might exist about UHAB or anything else related to the HDFC structure, but just to kind of put that out there. More generally, yeah, there is a history of some, I guess you would say, failures of these cooperatives. Again, going back to what I just mentioned, right? That this is typically housing that had been whether this is historically or more recent formations of these kinds of cooperatives, disinvested in for decades, right? And comprised of folks who are of limited incomes by and large. So it's a really difficult model and requires a lot of support and a lot of work to ensure their success. And even I think the numbers currently are that roughly, you know, somewhere between 10 to 20% of these kinds of low-income cooperatives are facing financial distress. You know, that could be alleviated through something like enhanced tax abatements on behalf of the city, which is something that's under discussion, right? So it's not necessarily always a question of mismanagement or, you know, somebody did something wrong, but just, you know, these are cooperatives that may have a very, you know, scant resources at their disposal. All of a sudden the ceiling is broken, the sewer, you know, pipe breaks on the portion that's owned by the cooperative, you know, all those kinds of things. You have unexpected expenses, and then you stop paying your property taxes, right? Those kinds of things, as you're forced to make those choices, just as anybody who's on a limited income needs to make. But by and large, the model is successful. But yeah, there are real concerns, and 15 to 20% facing financial distress is significant.
Or 80%, this would be like, you know, as the author of Public Housing That Worked, or 80% are successful. So thumbs up on that one.
Exactly.
Maybe that's about kind of the framing, you know, sort of issue there. All right. We should maybe go on to the next one. Max Gordy's question about, I'm wondering about the notion of exit affordability that Jonathan brought up, the idea of getting affordability benefits up front. How can we combat the challenges of mobility that come from this through program design? And then there's a second question. Do these programs have a plan for people eventually moving out of these buildings? And if people are never meant to move out, how do we address the problems that creates? Well, it's like that's a Gordian knot there. Thank you, Max Gordy. All right, does anyone want to jump into this? Let's start with the first one. The challenges of mobility that come through program design. It's an interesting one.
So if I could offer like a different way to think about this.
Sure.
Is that I don't think this is a flaw of program design. I think this is actually a function of how good a deal this housing is. Um, people feel stuck. I mean, I think it's a very good question because many people in Mitchell-Lama development say, like, how can I move? Like, I'm going to sell my share and I'm not going to profit off of it. And then I have to go rent, you know, I essentially have to go rent or try to buy somewhere else. Like, I can't do that. that is actually a function more of the larger environment than it is of Mitchell-Lama itself.
Mm.
So I think, this goes back to something that, Ben was saying earlier, is that if this model is bigger, wider, if the ecosystem of co-ops and permanently affordable housing is stronger, then this problem somewhat gets reduced dramatically. So I think, that's one way of thinking about this. I also think that, there is an aspect to these programs where, there are folks who live in Mitchell-Lamas who don't know that they live in a limited equity co-op. They think they're renters. And in some respects, in some respects they are, but they are also owners. And this notion of saving upfront is at counter purposes to, the prevailing way we think about building wealth or being able to move somewhere else afterwards. So that has to do somewhat with, cooperative education, support, as, Ben has mentioned, from, groups like UHAB and CU4ML, that this is a different model. And that means if you are going to move out of this model, you're moving from a sort of nonprofit, very affordable environment to one that is not. You're moving from decommodified to commodified, and that transition is difficult. There are ways to manage it. It just requires a lot of upfront support. But I do think this is, I don't think this is a flaw of the model. I think it's a flaw of the larger system.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
That the fact that cooperators remain in these co-ops over the years is actually a positive thing because it creates stability. And many of these co-ops become NORCs, which are naturally occurring retirement communities. So they don't need to leave. They don't need to acquire equity. They don't need to, amass a fortune to then go somewhere else to retire. They can retire in place in a situation where the city provides social services to them. So Mitchell-Lamas create a stability in communities. So that's a really valuable function of Mitchell-Lamas. They also create not just personal stability, but a community of people who've known each other for generations. So there are positive things about people staying in place.
Right. It's not necessarily stuck. People will see that.
Right, they're not stuck, they're thrilled.
I mean, based on the waiting list, I think a lot of people think that.
Yeah.
But I think it's different between trying to get in, right, and being in, and this idea like if you got a job somewhere else, right, or something like that, like you're not able to kind of cash out, right?
Well, that's why we have to change the whole
equity.
model of what housing is in this country.
Yeah.
But we live in a capitalist society, so that's extremely difficult. It used to be that the majority of people in New York City rented. The co-op movement really only happened post-war, maybe only starting really to accelerate in the 80s. So it's not really, like historically, been that long since people have owned their own apartments.
Yeah.
I think I just want to add one quick thing to this, if that's okay, which is that I think that, what both Jennifer and Jonathan have said about the sort of, co-ops right now are almost like, it's like a small island in an ocean of capital, right? And so they have a very different function than they would if they were a much larger sector of the housing in New York and elsewhere. I think the other thing to keep in mind is it also depends on the environment around you, right? In an environment in which housing value, apartment costs, whatever, aren't going up precipitously, right? If there isn't profit to be realized, co-ops look different than if there is profit to be realized. If costs go up versus rental costs, around you staying the same or going down, co-ops look different. And what co-ops provide is a certain kind of stability. And whether or not you want that stability to some extent depends on people's risk tolerance, but also on the broader opportunity for gain, at least in our society. And so I think that thinking about, that's partially why when we want to think about co-ops and one of, thinking about the future of them is that to some extent we're thinking about how do we construct a model that can thrive or be important as those circumstances change, regardless of what, or in response to that is flexible enough to change in relationship to those circumstances. You know, there's a period in which Co-op City, for example, is thought of as like a stepping stone for people. That's a thing that state officials would talk about, like, okay, you could live here, build up equity, and then move into a home of your own, or something people said a lot in the 80s and 90s. It's not something they were saying in the 60s and 70s, and it's not really something that they're saying today,
No, that's
because
fair.
those circumstances look so different.
Right. So the meaning of cooperative living shifts so much based on kind of the political
Absolutely.
economy, right, in
Right.
which we live, right? It's just,
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. All right. We have a question from Chris Johnson. What happens to the private developers taking the benefits of the loans taken by those through Mitchell-Lama? Cities given money to private developers, sell their labor to cost while the shareholders are kept out of the city money. Well, it's a little complicated because, you know, the private Mitchell-Lama developers, right, who have gone private. I mean, we haven't really talked about that at all in the sort of rental market, and it's a complicated thing. You know, they have great hopes of cashing out, but there's rent stabilization limits. It's a whole other world. But I mean, we haven't talked about the elephant in the room is, I mean, the cooperatives that have gone private. I mean, what do we know a lot about what's going on with them? I mean, Jonathan, you mentioned that they have a lot of headwinds, taxation and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, we can touch on this briefly. It gets complicated, but you know, functionally, when a co-op, Mitchell-Lama co-op privatizes it, it loses a number of different forms of subsidy. So it loses tax abatement. That
Big one.
jumps up, you know, that's a lot of money, jumps up really quickly. It loses access to sort of the, you know, subsidized financing from the state. And the way that these co-ops seek to mitigate that temporarily is through what's known as a flip tax. So essentially, when any of these cooperators under a privatized Mitchell-Lama sell their share, say they sell it for $1 million, they have to pay, you know, 20 to 30% of that to the co-op. So that is what is the argument for how that property tax increase, among other increases, is offset. That said, that only really applies to usually to the first sale of each share. All of this is worked out on a co-op by co-op basis. There's no standard boilerplate. There's a lower flip tax on secondary shares. So this is only going to last for a temporary period of time. Also, that entire model is predicated on sales. People have to leave in order for that place to remain quote unquote affordable to the people who already live there. So, for example, something that happened at Southbridge Towers, privatized in 2015, you know, they had, I should say, these privatization processes are incredibly complex. Cooperators this all gets routed through share offerings as if you were like a company going public. So you get these offering plans that are like 600, 700 page longs with complicated financials that cooperators are supposed to leaf through and make their decision. It's bonkers. But you know, they have specific projections they're trying to hit. Then say something like COVID hits. Real estate market shuts down temporarily. Those flip taxes aren't coming in. That, you know, the financials of the entire, you know, all of those projections can be thrown out the window. And that means carrying charges or maintenance increases can occur much sooner on existing cooperators who thought they were going to be fine. You know, maybe there's a person who's older is like, oh, well, you know, these higher rates will only hit when I'm gone, when I'm out of here. But, you know, maybe they hit in 5 years. And then what do you do? Literally, people who already own their apartments and live there may not be able to afford the carrying charges on them, may not be able to afford to keep living in a place that they own. So there, you know, that's some of the dynamics of the
So,
headwinds
you know,
you mentioned.
right. I mean, there's a risk, right? I mean, I think what Jonathan's getting to, right, is there is significant risk in going private, but not only for the overall health of the overall health of cooperative, again, because of its enormous mark, like depending on what location, right, you're in and so forth, right, there's an enormous incentive, right, in terms of the overall capitalization, right? But that doesn't mean that individuals, right, won't face significant stress or other issues as, for instance, the maintenance costs go up significantly. I would think it's probably likely that in every case, right, those maintenance costs would go up. So I think
Eventually, it'll happen eventually.
Oh, it's going to happen.
Just a question when.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else want to? It's we can go on to the next one. We must emphasize Mitchell-Lama co-ops, this is from Jay, survive depending on the city and state making financing available on a regular and reliable basis. The future housing needs to have built-in permanent financing role of government. Can that be done via legislation? All right, well, let's talk about the world we live in. I mean, I know Caitlin's also participated in some of this, you know, and Bobby and so forth, right? Can ongoing maintenance costs? I mean, we know historically, I mean, it wasn't built into the Mitchell-Lama program, but is that something that's talked about, like a permanent, ongoing, annual, kind of like public housing has, you know, an operating fund or things like that?
Well, I can actually speak to that very briefly in the context of Co-op City, which is that, so as I mentioned before, there's this rent strike in Co-op City in the mid-70s. At the time of the rent strike, then residents gained control of the cooperative from the United Housing Foundation, which doesn't entirely shut down, but for all intents and purposes, stops being building and constructing housing in the same way. Okay. Another piece of that rent strike agreement is that the state agrees to assume a significant portion of construction defect, like fixing construction defects. At the time, they don't realize quite what they're agreeing to. What they're agreeing to essentially is a will be in the matter of hundreds of millions of dollars to fix these construction defects, and a very complicated ongoing negotiation between the state and Co-op City that still to some extent is going on, but really is sort of at its height as more and more things come up, including like the entire plumbing system needs to be replaced, stuff like that. And figuring out in advance, like part of the problem, and I believe it was Jonathan, a couple of you, I think, mentioned this in various ways, that Mitchell-Lama was not, the idea of ongoing costs associated with sort of this, I think, you know, they've set it and forget it idea initially. Well, if there's an acknowledgement up front that there will be ongoing costs, that these ongoing costs need to be borne by somebody, and it shouldn't just be the residents, that a lot of that, I think, I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I think it starts with the acknowledgement of that ongoing costs will be important for maintenance, even in the best constructed development, even in the best potential environment. And that, I think, from there, you can start to talk about what a program design looks like that takes that into account in a sort of fair and equitable way.
Right, like a rotating capital fund, something along that.
Something like that, yeah.
That would be, instead of being kind of always in an emergency kind of thing. The only thing I would say, Anne Marie, as a, you know, like an aside, obviously when you start talking, having like a real conversation about, you know, those long-term costs, then that, you know, then there's a realistic, you know, the numbers look different, right? You know, exactly. When you're talking about an annual operating support or a rotating capital or things like that. But, you know, we should be clear too that, I mean, it's, if you look at the tax abatements and other things, the lower cost interest that were provided to Mitchell-Lama lenders and so forth, I mean, there were significant subsidies that had long-term impacts, but even those have not reached, right, to the cash on the barrelhead, like, you know, pay for that new plumbing system and so forth.
Exactly. And if you recognize, like, you're gonna at some point, and maybe sooner or maybe later, pay for a new plumbing system or pay for asbestos abatement or whatever, that's very different than it being like, oh my God, we have to do this now, and there's been no planning, and it's like cutting costs wherever you can, that then creates new problems down the road.
Well, you know, Henry, just okay, go ahead. Can I just add one little thing, and then I'll get you, Jennifer. But you know, the other side is it also could influence design, right? Which is that had the United Housing Foundation had to think about long-term costs, maybe they wouldn't have built 25 high-rise towers in the middle of an open field. I would just say that, you know, from
yes, and without anyone who understood the very complex engineering of building on top of on top of a landfill on top of swamp. Yeah.
So there could be a good
as it may.
There could be a good iterative process by having a realistic discussion about long-term costs. Jennifer, take it away.
I was just going to say that there is money there. It's just how the particular co-op wants to spend it. At RNA House, there was money there to improve the look of the lobby, to make it look like it was a luxury high-rise. That's where they took their money, and they could have used that money to fix structural problems. But instead, they prioritized, turning the security guard into a concierge. So there is money there, and the city does provide low cost mortgages to there are things in place. It really, I guess it really does come down to personal management of each building.
Yeah,
Is
that's a big factor.
One
Yeah.
thing I want to note, and I think this goes, to the original question of like, can this be done legislatively? There are ways to, as has been talked about, developer revolving loan funds. I think this gets to the importance of an ecosystem of support. We cannot think about housing alone, public banks, that sort of financing. The idea of the Social Housing Development Authority itself is in some ways about, creating a mechanism to have this funding available. But all of that is politically driven. It can change, it can be removed. You can have a quote unquote permanent affordable thing that is no longer permanently affordable because of political changes. And that means building a political project around it that makes it impossible or very, very, very difficult to remove this from, to make this housing commodified once it is decommodified. It goes back to the point about, if we had a proper social safety net, people wouldn't be trying to instrumentalize their housing to pay for healthcare costs. If there was if there was proper healthcare. So I think that we cannot think about developing a co-op ecosystem alone. It needs this support from various other aspects of society.
Okay. We have maybe I think iPhone, we've addressed some of that, the need for public support. Olivia, I think I know that, Olivia. But anyway, many of our critics point to the challenge faced by Mitchell-Lama. They're proof we should not do something like Mitchell-Lama 2.0 because we should not be in the business of creating housing programs, whether rental or homeownership, that require constant ongoing subsidy. I mean, we are a bit in a consensus trap here, I suppose, where we think this is a good thing. But, maybe you want to, sort of draw back, like, is this something just a New York City issue or something like that? I mean, what is what's your response to the critique?
I mean,
Oh.
I think it bears saying that, the biggest form of housing subsidy in the US is the mortgage interest tax deduction.
Right.
All of our housing is publicly supported and subsidized in some respect. It's about what kind of housing we want to, on an ongoing basis, subsidize and support. So in some ways, I think, we have to reframe our ideas of what constitutes subsidy, what is, public investment, what do we get from that public investment? Because it's there, as Jennifer said, the money's there. But what are we using to support with it?
Anyone else?
Yeah,
I definitely think the money is there. Ben, did you want to add?
I just want to say, and probably even the bigger boogeyman for these sort of arguments is public housing, and this idea that any kind, that this was a huge mistake, and that any sort of large-scale public programs for the support of housing is inevitably going to be a failure. But and I think this also, not to say that there aren't continued problems with public housing in New York, but kind of going back to the point about waiting lists and things like that, right? One of the lines about public housing in New York, right, being like, oh, everyone hates public housing except for the people who live there and the people who are trying to live there, right? So there's also arguments, again, that doesn't, not to dismiss the real issues with public housing, but I think that also speaks to some of the points of this question. I don't have an incredibly satisfying answer, but I think to reiterate, I mean, Jonathan's point, I think, was really, really fantastic, and the main counter argument, but also, reiterating the successes of these issues, and particularly judged by the folks who have lived there. Not to say that there aren't issues that can be learned from, which I think a lot of this panel has kind of pointed to, but that the people that by and large these have been really successful programs that, especially by when judged by the folks who have actually had experience living in them, overwhelmingly really speak to this being a kind of beneficial experience. And so that I think is, extraordinarily compelling evidence, right? That these are good things and good for the people who inhabit these kinds of housing, and also good for the city.
All right. Well, thank you very much to our panelists, to our hosts, Caitlin, Bobby, and the Green New Deal. And thanks. I think it was a great conversation, and I think that's our time.
Yeah, awesome. I can just quickly close it out. I'd like to thank all of the panelists so much for joining us today. Thank you for really having an incredibly interesting conversation about a really important kind of issue that we're continuing to face here in New York City, with kind of the future of these co-ops and how we should move forward with this form of housing. This panel discussion was recorded, and the recording will be emailed to folks who attended. I also want to mention, for folks who are interested in getting more involved with our campaign, that we have a sign-up link that I've just dropped in the chat. As well, we've dropped links for all of the authors' books, particularly those that are pertaining most directly to kind of cooperative housing. So Professor Bloom, for you, we did affordable housing in New York, since that hits on co-ops a little bit. We're really grateful that you all joined us on this wonderful Sunday early afternoon. And again, thank you so much for being here. There will also be an affordable housing finance 101 training that this campaign is running on September 9th. And you can stay tuned to howsthefuture.com or our social media channels for more information on that. Thank you so much again, and hope to see you all at a How's the Future event of some sort soon.